Good evening, friends, fellow Americans, and citizens of the planet. Welcome to the Green State of the Union, where we will take stock of what the state of our union really is. And I dare say it is not safe, strong, and proud America. I would say it is an America in revolt, an America that is standing up for justice and for transformation. You might note we didn't hear the word justice mentioned once, nor the word equality, nor poverty, nor peace. What we heard basically was a distressing and dystopian vision of a world at perpetual war and paying an incredible price for that at home. So we'll be talking about the real state of our union and how we take that union forward to create an America and a world that works for all of us, not just for the corporations and the 1% who really are the beneficiaries of the policies that Donald Trump was describing and of the bipartisan agenda that has been enacted for the past many decades, and of which Donald Trump is really the latest and extreme expression. Before we dive in, I want to ask you as a first order of business to help build that movement and that resistance, to please share this discussion. Please share this real state of the union by liking and sharing this live stream to help get the word out, because as many of you know, the titans, the big CEOs, the big corporations that control our internet communications have shifted their so-called algorithms in order to suppress those voices of resistance. But by sharing ourselves and by expanding our networks, we can help overcome that censorship, which is part of our job that we must do in this day of attacks on our democracy, justice, and our future. So basically, we're here to reality check. I'll be speaking for about 10 or 15 minutes. I'll turn it over then to my illustrious running mate in 2016, Ajamu Baraka, and then we'll be taking your questions. So please feel free to post questions or comments, and we'll be going through them and answering them. And we look forward to this dialogue. Because what we've heard basically is an incredible fake news dump that is intended to really keep us dispirited and keep us downhearted, because if we are hopeless, then we are powerless. But on the flip side of that, if we recognize our power, then we have very much to be hopeful for and to actually insist upon. In the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. But contrary to what Donald Trump says, we do have the power. Remember, what you've just heard from is the most disliked president in our history, whose ratings, whose popularity ratings are as low as any president's has ever been. In a party that is in trouble. Actually, both parties are in trouble, but the Republicans more so, and at a time when people are clamoring for other political representation. And we'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to first share a few words to help debunk this false analysis of where we are and these false solutions that Donald Trump has put forward. Let me set the record straight just in regards to a couple of things that he said. You know, first he was thanking the frontline defenders on the front lines of fires and storms and floods and hurricanes. Well, Donald Trump, where did all that come from? That's about climate change. And it's not enough to thank our workers after they have put their lives at risk, and many of them lost their lives in the line of service and in the line of emergency, not to mention the victims in Houston, in Puerto Rico, where the numbers are off the charts of the excess mortality during the first month after that hurricane. So the numbers of people, as well as the tragic deaths in the fires in California, not to mention, huge numbers. And I should add the mudslides as well. And these are global phenomena where the lives lost are far greater than what we have experienced to date. All of these are tragedies that are going to get much bigger. The world is seeing 65 million refugees, largely from wars and from poverty related to U.S. Domination, wars and economic domination and exploitation and colonialism. So, 65 million people were on the move in the last year. That's going to turn to 650 million by the end of the century if these climate policies are allowed to continue. And Donald Trump is even making them worse than they currently are. So, it begs to be noted that he was quick to thank those who are putting their lives on the line, but he himself has absolutely done nothing about it. That's absolutely intolerable. He prides himself on destroying regulations, but remember, regulations are protections for public health, for workers' safety, for our water and our air. So, we're seeing Donald Trump present the corporate vision of society, a very dystopian vision. These regulations are protections, and they need to be enhanced. In some cases, they can be streamlined, and they should be. But our protections should not be thrown to the wind here. He talks about FDA approving more generic drugs. Well, he just appointed to the head of Health and Human Services the head of one of the drug companies who has most extremely escalated the costs, the skyrocketing costs of pharmaceuticals. So, all well and good for Donald Trump to promise that he's going to take down the high costs of pharmaceuticals. How are you going to do that when you're appointing as head of Health and Human Services one of the chief architects of the skyrocketing costs of our pharmaceuticals? I think the cost of insulin doubled, if I have my facts correctly here. The cost of insulin doubled under the person, Azar, that he just appointed to Health and Human Services. He's talking about 1.5 trillion, in infrastructure investments, where federal dollars will be matched. Well, or I should put it another way, federal dollars will match state and local investments. But the tax plan that he just passed is going to slash state and local investments. Those investments depend on state and local revenues and also on municipal bonds. That is the ability of local governments to borrow the money in order to fund these projects. But because of changes worked into the tax cuts, those bonds are going to be very hard to come by. It's going to be very hard for state and local government to be able to put the money down in order to develop these infrastructure improvements. So this is actually, it's a terrible plan. And there's a wonderful investigative report that I should mention on the Real News Network that looks at what the impact of this infrastructure development plan is going to be on water resources. Essentially, it's going to privatize water utilities, both sewage treatment as well as the provision of drinking water. So, we're hearing Donald Trump, the salesman, the snake oil salesman, in his dystopian vision of the future. So, I know you don't need to be convinced that this is not a reliable person that you've just heard from. But I couldn't let pass some of the outrages that he spoke of. And quickly, to mention a couple more, he talked about being able to fire federal workers. And I wasn't able to hear all of that just because we had a technical problem with our connection. But this doesn't bode well. This is yet another assault on working people in America who've been really thrown under the bus with regard to union protections and wages. Donald Trump talked about how the tide is being reversed, that wages are starting to go up. A minute amount, while the costs of living continue to skyrocket for healthcare, for education, and for housing. So this is nothing but snake oil salesmanship, smoke and mirrors, not a word of it to be believed. He talked about renovating our nuclear weapons. And yes, unfortunately, that was begun by Barack Obama, who called for $1.5 trillion worth of investments. I think what's going on right now in North Korea, where you have North and South Korea getting together to actually begin the process of reconciliation, to begin dialogue, to begin diplomacy. That is the way forward. And they put to shame Donald Trump with his warmongering, with his war drills of pretending, or actually enacting and rehearsing the dropping of nuclear bombs on North Korea. That's why North Korea felt driven to develop a nuclear weapons deterrent. And North Korea is a good example of where you get with a kind of warmongering and threatening that Donald Trump has, adopted as the basis of his foreign policies and his domestic policies as well, for that matter. And yet we see with South Korea, which has basically extended an olive branch, we see them really taking substantive steps forward and beginning to actually discuss how they can get to that place of peace and reconciliation, which should include a peace treaty. The Korean War has never been concluded. We need to stop these war rehearsals and actually establish a cessation of hostilities and what's called a freeze for a freeze treaty, which essentially, I should say, is a freeze for a freeze strategy, whereby North Korea agrees to freeze any further development of nuclear bombs or ballistic missiles. North Korea will freeze its program in exchange for the United States and South Korea freezing its program. That is the war games. So here we have a very good example of a policy that's moving forward with peace and diplomacy in a very good and solid way, while Donald Trump's warmongering has only made matters worse. So it's an example of how these problems, which are described as intractable, actually are not intractable. They can be solved. His intention to reopen Guantanamo, which has been reduced, the numbers of prisoners have been reduced, but to sort of reestablish it is absolutely outrageous and plays right into the playbook of terrorist groups that want to point to the human rights abuses, the outrages, the torture being conducted by the United States, which is a wonderful way for our adversaries to build support and to recruit more people to their ranks. So this is exactly the wrong things to be done. Likewise, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, which is a really terrible idea, and has really incensed nations all over the world. So Donald Trump, is taking a loner's approach, my way or the highway, to the world, and the vision he's promoting really is that of an empire which is teetering at the brink and promoting the neoliberal order, which in fact is melting down. That is endless wars abroad, austerity and economic struggle here at home, a growing climate emergency, and an assault on democracy. His agenda will continue dismantling civil society as we know it, worsening the assault on working people, women, immigrants, people of color, the poor, disabled, the LGBTQ community, and our democracy itself. I'm going to let Ajamu speak to the issue of militarism, since he has been so powerfully focused on that. And in the interest of time, I'll just say, we are off the charts as an empire with 800 bases around the world, special ops in over 140 countries around the world. Half of our budget now dedicated to the military, $5 trillion, that's $23,000 per American taxpayer spent on these endless wars. on terror in the Middle East alone. You know, it's outrageous what we've been paying to accomplish what? Failed states, mass refugee migrations, and worse terrorist threats. What's happening now in Afghanistan is a real symbol of where this policy has led. In spite of these outrageous expenditures, over 1 million people killed in Iraq alone, tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers killed and wounded. You know, we're back where we started, essentially, in Afghanistan. More of the same is not going to fix it. We need a way forward based on diplomacy, international law, and human rights. The flip side of militarism is the incredible austerity here at home, with 75% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck now, 43 million students in student debt, for which there is really no hope of ending, because the jobs that are coming back, and yes, indeed, there are jobs, but 95% of the jobs that have been created since the so-called recovery are low-wage, part-time, insecure, and temporary jobs. 95% of the wealth created in the last year has gone to the 1%, 0% of that wealth, and these are global figures, 0% of the wealth created in the last year has gone to the lower 50%. So Donald Trump can feed you his cherry-picked numbers, but they're not going to do it for us. I'm going to just briefly mention a couple things. We need transformative change. We need real policies that speak to the crises that we face. We are calling, in the Green Agenda, we're calling for a Green New Deal, creating 20 million good wage jobs that will address right now, on an emergency basis, the crisis of the economy and the crisis of the climate. It will jumpstart the economy with the good jobs focused on sustainable and green energy, food, and transportation. It will jumpstart the economy. It will turn the tide on climate change. And guess what? It makes the friggin' wars for oil obsolete, at the same time that it also massively reduces our health costs, which are a huge, it's like 20% of our GDP is being spent on health while we are getting sicker because we have such an outrageous, wasteful healthcare system, and because we are making people sick. I shouldn't say we, I mean the fossil fuels that Donald Trump has been praising as the beautiful, clean coal, etc. Coal is the dirtiest among them. These are the fossil fuels that are making us sick and sicker while they bankrupt us. So by moving to the green economy, and we call for doing that by the year 2030, a truly emergency program, an emergency mobilization that basically pays for itself. It's a win-win. At the same time, we call for healthcare and education as human rights. They also pay for themselves. We know that higher education pays back 7 times over the cost, and we know that from the GI Bill following the Second World War. The same is true for healthcare. We need to redistribute the cost, but essentially it's the same cost. That cost should be borne by those who can most afford it. I should also mention that Donald Trump's health tax plan, he talked about how great it's going to be for working people. Well, unfortunately, those benefits for middle class and working people, those benefits last for about a couple of years, but then they phase out. On the other hand, the massive benefits, and over 80% of the $1.5 trillion worth of giveaways here, it all goes to the top 5% or so. And those benefits don't go away. It's the benefits for everyday people that go away. So we need a just tax structure that asks those who are most benefited by the system to pay back their fair share. In doing so, we can provide health care and education and transportation. We need to end the deportations and create a welcoming path to citizenship. Donald Trump's speech was extremely divisive and played on racist notions of immigrants as the source of gang violence. Actually, that gang violence south of the border came from the U.S. in people who were deported. And it's also promoted by the endless drug wars related to the U.S. drug policy to prohibition, which should be ended. We should legalize marijuana and treat other drugs as health and public health issues, not as criminal issues. That would go a long way to stop the violence around drugs on both sides of the border, which can only be blamed really on U.S. drug policy. Immigrants are among the most productive and peaceful communities in the United States. And it's an outrage for Donald Trump to have mischaracterized and just smeared the immigrant community as he did. We need a welcoming path to citizenship for the recipients of DACA, for the TPS, people protected by temporary protective status, who should also be granted citizenship. Prison reform, God knows what he has in mind, but let's end the war on drugs and the mass incarceration related to that. And then we should be discharging from our prisons the people, the nonviolent drug offenders who should not have been incarcerated in the first place. And finally, we need a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy. One last thing I'm going to mention before passing the baton to Ajamu, and that is we also need ranked choice voting, because the politics of fear is used to intimidate voters into voting for the lesser evil. But we've seen over and over again that the lesser evil just paves the way for the greater evil. In many ways, Donald Trump is a symbol of that. Most people who voted for Trump were not voting for him. They were voting against Hillary Clinton, the Democrats, and the legacy of betrayal, of NAFTA, of exporting our jobs, of throwing workers under the bus. People were voting against that, the legacy of both the lesser evil and the greater evil. We need to lead the way forward. We need to be able to go into the polls and vote for what we want, not against the candidate we most dislike. Democracy needs a moral compass. We need to be that moral compass. Ranked choice voting allows us to actually bring our values to our votes and to let our vision drive the way forward. Shout out to the state of Maine, which is leading the way. They passed ranked choice voting as a referendum. They're defending it against the Democrats and Republicans who are trying to repeal it because they want to use fear to intimidate you to stay inside the corporate system, the two parties of war and Wall Street that has thrown the American people under the bus. We can create an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. The power to create that world is in our hands. I'm going to turn it over to Ajamu now to take it from there, and then we'll be both back to talk with you further and take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jill, for your very thorough analysis of the Trump State of the Union. And my position is very similar to yours in terms of recognizing the fact that there was very little there in terms of policy. That what we saw was the continuation of the politics as usual. The same kinds of policies being pushed have been pushed by Obama, by Bush, indeed by every president since Jimmy Carter, who have been consistently pushing the politics and policies of neoliberalism. And what we have with the Trump administration and the conditions that we face today is the consequence of more than 4 decades of neoliberal policy. It begs the question, and it was raised in my mind listening to Donald Trump's presentation, when he talks about the prosperity that allegedly people are experiencing in this country. He talks about the economic recovery, and the question becomes, recovery for who? Prosperity for who? When we look at what is happening in this country, and you and I have been out there on the road, even after the campaign. It seems like that Donald Trump and his gang of billionaires who he has around him, they really live in an alternative universe. They talk about the fact that people are making more money, that prosperity is here for everyone. But when you move around the country, it's very difficult to see those realities. What we see instead is a continuation of people who don't have a place to put their heads at night. We see that there's still millions of people who are unable to secure health care for themselves. We recognize and know that people have not been able to experience any real significant increase in their wages. And in fact, what we see around the country is the continuation of a precarious existence for most workers here in this country. So what we see with this speech tonight and the policies and the world view represented by Donald Trump is a faulty attempt to try to legitimize a understanding and presentation of reality that only is being experienced by the rich. That the realities of the more than 40 million people who are still living in poverty, the millions of people who are unable to secure a job with a living wage, the millions of people who have been forced out of the labor market, the millions of people who are unable to afford a decent house, who are struggling, if they do have jobs, to spend more than half of their income on rents, the millions of people who are living in fear of getting sick. These are the realities that most people in this country face. These are the realities that Donald Trump and the Democrats are not addressing in any kind of way. They're not addressing those realities because they cannot address those realities, because they have no policies to address those realities. All they can present to the American people is this notion of the return of something called the American dream. What they don't want people to understand is that so-called American dream was never a dream for most people here in this country. And that the basis of that American dream, which has been the exploitation and the oppression of people around the world and the creation and expansion of this empire, that situation and those conditions are in fact changing. And as a consequence of the people of the world who are now rising up and taking control of their own economies and their own destinies, the impact is that the material reality of people in this country are being changed fundamentally. But no one is explaining to the American people that reality. So what happens? We have demagogues like Donald Trump who would tell the American people that the reason why your lifestyle has changed, the reason why you are struggling, is not because of the structural violence that is endemic to this capitalist system. It is because of those foreigners, those others, those people who are undermining our lifestyle, who are invading, or as Donald Trump said, breaking into this country. But what we have to do, Jill, we have to remind the American people that the jig is up. We understand the game being played, and that if people are really committed to changing their situation, if people are really committed to constructing lives of dignity in this country, if people really believe in the future of this country, then we have to understand that we have to fight for social justice. We have to fight for democracy, because both of these parties are committed to a rapacious, backward, neoliberal capitalism that only benefits a small minority of the population. So the watchword for us tonight is struggle. It is staying clear. It is understanding that our interests are not the same as the interests of Donald Trump and the millionaires and billionaires that he represents. We have to be clear about that. We have to have a clear ideological position in terms of who we are, what our interests are, and what kind of world we know we have to construct in order to ensure that we all can live lives of dignity where our fundamental human rights are respected. So my last comment on tonight, and relating this to the fact that we recognize that we are standing shoulder to shoulder with working people and oppressed people around the world. We say that because of that reality, we're not going to allow ourselves to be manipulated into any kind of conflict with any other oppressed and working class population on this planet. We're not going to allow the 1% to send our sons and daughters off to fight for their interests. We have to initiate a rupture with this ruling class. We've got to reclaim the mantle of internationalism and understanding of our common humanity, and not allow ourselves to be manipulated into conflict with any other nation and any other people on this planet. We have to struggle. We have to fight for peace. So, my friends, our task tonight is to understand that. Our task is to recommit ourselves to the politics of liberation, recognizing that we have one common humanity, and we're not going to allow ourselves to be manipulated into believing that the racialized other is our enemy. We have to build unity, construct a vision for the future, and be prepared to fight for that future. That is our historic task. That is the situation that we face today with this bipartisan agreement to ensure that we remain, that is the working class and poor people, that we remain disorganized and disempowered. But we have a message for them. We understand who we are. We understand the kind of vision that we have to construct. We understand our power and our potential. And we are ready to fight for the future for ourselves and for those who come after us. That is the message for the Green Party. That is the message for progressive forces here in this country. Let's get to work.
Thank you so much, Ajamu. It's wonderful to hear your powerful vision directly again. And I again want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight and to encourage you right now to take that first step in struggle that Ajamu talks about. Take that first step right now by helping us fight back against censorship by the 1% that's trying to suppress people's communications through the internet. So just by, again, liking and sharing this live stream, you'll help the word for this real people's State of the Union go much farther than the establishment wants it to go. So thank you for doing that like and share. And we have time to take a few of your questions. And if you have some questions you'd like to pose, please post them as comments on the live stream. And I'm going to start off taking one here. Someone named Equality Love says, Jill, what's the Green Party going to do different in order to win in 2020? So let me just say that we have candidates who aren't waiting for 2020. They've started right now, and I may even have a list of them here. Yes, I have some of them right here. You can find out who's running right now and go to gp.org and find the list of candidates for 2018. We've got great candidates for governor: Angel Torres in Arizona, Josh Jones in California, Betsy Marsano in Maine, Ian Schlackman in Maryland, running with Reverend Annie Chambers for lieutenant governor, Jennifer Kurland in Michigan, Connie Goodell Newton in Ohio, Janice Richards in Texas. Many candidates also running, for Congress and for Senate. So what we're doing right now is getting the word out and getting organized. Ajamu is working with a wonderful group called the Black Alliance for Peace. And many of us are working with other organizations on the front lines, but we're also really working to build the political battle right now. And I urge you to get in touch with candidates and to get in touch with your local party, because we're the ones we've been waiting for. No one else is going to do it. The time has never been better for it. More people than ever. We're at a record high for the number of people who say they are looking for a new, independent, major political party that can actually work on behalf of the people instead of throwing the people under the bus like the two major parties have been doing. So this is really the time to seize the moment. So I urge you to get involved. And let me turn that question over to you, Ajamu, just to hear, your thoughts about what people should do to help build the basis for a win in 2020 and in 2018.
Well, I think that you pointed out, I think correctly, that the attention has to be on building the apparatus, on having a focus on the immediate, which is 2018. It's important for people to understand that whatever kinds of strides that we make in 2018 will have us I think, positioned better for 2020. It's important for people to understand that we have to build. And the only way we're going to be effective as a third-party challenge is to strengthen our apparatus, which means that people have to be more involved, that we have to not only support candidates, but we have to build the party apparatuses across the country. So I would say get involved, reach out to people in your community, to organizations in your community, ground yourself in those communities, build those relationships, and articulate a vision that says that we are in a fight for democracy, but that fight is going to be a protracted fight. And that if people really believe in the possibility of democracy, if they're really committed to having democratic choice, then they have to understand that we have to fight in order to open up the process to allow for people to have the ability to exercise their choice. So radicalizing democracy in this country is absolutely critical for us to build the kind of alternative power that we have to build in order to transform this society, because it's only through transformation that we're going to be able to address the real needs of the masses of the people out there.
We've had a number of questions, and I'm scrolling through the questions here as we're talking. We've had a number of questions about what do I do next. People have said they went to their Green Party local meeting and were encouraged to run for office. And I know, Ajamu, you were someone who got dragged into this in a big way back in 2016 when I sort of twisted your arm into jumping in. And maybe you can say a couple words about how you sort of made that transition to running for office. Before I turn it over to you, I just want to note that the National Green Party, the GPUS, has a series of tutorials that are intended for people to learn how to run and what you have to get together to do that, and how to fundraise, and how to recruit your team, how to write your press release. There are workshops also for people who want to help and who want to be that team. So I want to refer you to the Green Party US website, where you can find some of those resources, because there is a lot to know. And I just say, don't be shy. You don't have to know it before you jump in. You learn actually by doing it. Ajamu, do you want to say a couple words about what it was like for you to jump in, whole hog from the outset?
Well, it was very interesting, because I came in as an organizer, which means that I saw the campaign, like I see the electoral arena, as an area of struggle, as a tool, an instrument for building alternative popular power. So for me, the running as a candidate, participating in the electoral process, is not really an end. It is a means to an end. Because for me, again, the objective is the transformation of this society, is shifting power from the 1%, from the ruling elite, to the people. It is building a real democracy as opposed to this oligarchy that is masked as a democracy. So, when you have that kind of approach, then you can approach this work in a more focused and systematic way. You're not going to be dissuaded from struggle. You're not going to be, your spirit won't be dampened if you don't win an election. Your strategy will be to bring in other people like yourself and to reach out to other organizations, because we have to have also an organizational base to these candidacies also. So, we have to think about this thing differently from the two major parties. We want candidates, we want good candidates, but we also want to build an apparatus, and we want to always keep the politics in command.
Absolutely. And as you say, Ajamu, it really is it's a means to an end, and that end is to build, and you build by doing. And a number of people have mentioned here in the comments that in addition to running for office as Greens, we're involved with frontline communities, and we're fighting to stop pipelines, to protect the water supplies, as in Standing Rock. We're fighting for jobs and for living wages and for health care, and to stop the war. And we build relationships on the ground, fighting on the issues with people. And by building those relationships, we then develop partnerships with which to then run for office. So don't be shy, learn by doing, and just don't let them take your don't let them make you a passive participant. Change the system and challenge the system. In the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. We need to be that demand. Quickly here, I want to just throw a question at you, Ajamu. How about from Carol Joy Wolf? Why was Puerto Rico not mentioned? FEMA is cutting off their shipments of food and water. Why are they doing that? Do you want to say a word about Puerto Rico?
Jill, you froze up, so I didn't get all of the question. You said, why was Puerto Rico what?
Not mentioned. And I think she means in the State of the Union address. There's not much question about that. And that FEMA is cutting off their shipments of food and water. I didn't realize that. And she asks, why would FEMA be cutting off support? So you want to say a few words about status of Puerto Rico?
No, I think that I'm glad that she raised that question. As you can see, the theme of the speech tonight was not a theme that was really focused on the plight of real people. It was a theme that was more framed to to kind of shore up the system, to advance the notion that everything was all right, and therefore you only focus in on those quote unquote success stories. Well, Puerto Rico is not a success story. Puerto Rico is an example of the failures of a colonial policy that has only resulted in the exploitation and the oppression of a whole people, reducing Puerto Rico to a situation where it is completely dependent on the U.S., unable to seek out support from other nations because of its colonial status. And as a consequence, we have now months after the hurricane, and people are still living in dire straits in that country. So, again, our responsibility is to raise those kinds of questions, to tell the stories of people who are the victims of this system. Those people who are not going to be able to receive bonuses of thousands and thousands of dollars. Those people who are still trying to struggle to pay their bills with their two temporary and part-time jobs. Those people who are still trying to figure out how they pay for their child care so that they can, in fact, get to their temporary and part-time jobs. There's a whole reality that working class people face that the Donald Trumps of the world will never understand. And that's why it is absolutely necessary for parties like the Green Party to be committed to telling those stories, grounding itself in those realities, being committed to building a political party and a movement that champions the rights and the interests of working people and poor people here in this country. If we keep clear about that, then we will be successful because the Democrat Party can only give lip service to working class people and poor people. They are still committed essentially to neoliberal capitalism and the logic of profit and exploitation that is a part of. So we have to be the alternative. We have to raise those critical concerns and those critical questions. So thank you for that question.
And just to piggyback on that, the Democratic Party tonight, they had their response to the State of the Union address. They did not ask Bernie Sanders to give that response. Bernie Sanders has, he's a convenient voice when they need him, but this is not the Democrat. That is not the voice of the Democratic Party. They chose actually Joe Kennedy III to speak. He's the grandson of Robert Kennedy, a congressman from Massachusetts now, I believe. Although I can't verify that actually. I can't say that for sure. Somewhere in the Northeast, I believe. He has a very low profile, and he's distinguished himself in opposing the legalization of marijuana, in opposing the protection even of patients who are the recipients of and who need medical marijuana, for example, for the nausea of chemotherapy treatment or for the treatment of very difficult to treat seizure disorders. There are many medical applications of marijuana that patients are entitled to. And he's one of the few members of the Democratic Party who is actually voting against the protections for medical marijuana and to allow the feds to go after the states, both the practitioners who are prescribing it, as well as the dispensaries, as well as the patients who are sick and need it. And he's also from what I can tell, a centrist Democrat who has not come out to support single payer. So this, again, I should say, or still is the voice of the Democratic Party. And you add that to the fact that The progressives were recently purged from the leadership of the Democratic National Committee. The fact that the Democratic National Committee is supporting centrist Democrats, discouraging progressives, and not supporting them in the primary races. We hear about interference, all these questions about interference in the 2016 election. Well, how about the interference of the DNC? The Democratic National Committee rigged the primary, and that was admitted by its leadership, who got removed, basically, after they were exposed for having done that, for having colluded with the media to elevate Donald Trump, so that thinking that Hillary Clinton would then have a beatable opponent, and for basically sabotaging Bernie Sanders. That is sabotage, okay? So that's what the DNC is still doing. They are still rigging their primaries in order to choose the centrist candidates that promote the agenda of their funders. So you just have to ask at some point, how many times are people going to go through this? Are people really going to sleepwalk back into the same thing and think that the Democrats are going to fight back? They're just going to be one step shy of the, agenda of the Republicans to try to win over Republican voters. Instead of actually doing the right thing, the thing that justice would dictate, and ultimately the thing that will win, because it's almost half of voters who don't bother to come out and vote for the two major parties who are really there for the taking. It's that 61% of voters who are clamoring for another way forward. So this is the time to stand up. I think we'll take one last question here. Nicole Harrington asks, can we make all healthcare not for profit? Do you want to answer that, Ajamu?
Well, I have some very distinctive positions on this. I believe that we should take out profit in the healthcare sector. That if we are really serious about addressing healthcare and holding that up as a fundamental human right, then we have to decommodify healthcare. It means that there should be public ownership of the hospital chains, of the pharmaceutical companies, of the hospital equipment companies, that we eliminate, of course, all private insurance. We take out the artificial cost that is part of the system of a healthcare system that is geared toward profit. So for me, I think Medicare for all, or improved Medicare for all, is a very significant step. Single payer, but I think is a step. I think if we're going to have real health care that's going to be affordable to all in this country, we need, and the health care that is seen, in fact, as a human right, then we need to decommodify health care. So I'm all for taking profit out of that process and putting the healthcare sector under public control completely.
Great. And, that is a very important debate where I think we've just begun to really discuss where would healthcare go. We've got enough, fight on our hands for the moment. And a huge amount of education has been done, and it's a credit to all the advocates for healthcare as a human right that they've put single payer really within our reach. It's absolutely within our reach. The public is educated, supports it. We should be there right now. But you're right. For the long term, there needs to be a lot more discussion and debate about which system is it ultimately that can be most sustainable, most just, and get the job done. It's a real commentary on the crisis of American healthcare. This news today that Amazon and JP Morgan, and I forget, there was a third, and Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett, that these three big corporations have gotten together in order to form some massive healthcare alternative where they say that they are not going to pursue profit. They're going to try to serve their their workers and create a affordable, quality healthcare. What a shame on our healthcare system that we are looking to private profiteering corporations in order to provide basic health care for the American people. This is where, this is where the vision of Donald Trump goes, to, as you say, Ajamu, our basic rights are being privatized here and are being profiteered. And, famous last words that they're not going to pursue profits, that's just in their DNA of corporations. They're legally obliged to pursue profits. So, don't hold your breath that they're not going to be pursuing profits or that they're going to get the job done. They're not. We really need healthcare as a human right for everyone in this country. It more than pays for itself. It's just the slavish service to the private healthcare industry and pharmaceuticals that maintains this very oppressive healthcare structure that we have right now. So again, in the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We do have it. It's all about our getting together, and it's all about our taking our future back. I'll give you a moment, Ajamu, to just say any parting words. Do you have a couple thoughts to share as we go out tonight? And again, if everyone can please share this conversation, like it and share this live stream, we'll fight the power together, and we'll bring closer the day when we prevail. So, give us a few parting words, Ajamu.
There are two issues that I would like for people to really think about and to be ready to struggle against, and that is the growing censorship and new McCarthyism that we find ourselves in because of the crisis of capitalism. We have allowed for the Democrats to push a process that has resulted in a collaboration between the Democratic Party, the corporate sector, and the state to basically behind our backs, as we were so focused in on the theatrics of Donald Trump and the alt-right. The liberal totalitarians have basically moved in and convinced Twitter, Google, Facebook, to engage in a process of restricting the access of information, alternative information and analysis for the U.S. public and really for the global public. So we have to be aware of that and resist that, because it's a very dangerous turn that has taken place over the last few months. Secondly, we have to be outraged by the kind of militarism that's been normalized here in this country. We have to stand very clearly in opposition to any attempt on the part of this empire to send our sons and daughters off to fight for their interests. We're not going to fall for the okie doke, if you will, that we have some kind of permanent conflict and tension with any people on this planet. So we say, let's be resistant to the growing militarism. The Green Party and the campaign, we had a platform that said basically we should be committed to peace. That any of the issues we see in the international arena now can be addressed and peacefully. We don't need to have a $700 billion Pentagon budget. We don't need to be wasting $1 trillion a year on war and conflict. We say, as a starting point, cut the military budget in half. Use those resources to address the real needs of the people of this country. Bring all of the U.S. Forces home. Close all U.S. foreign bases. Let's eliminate the scourge of war, and that's shed one drop of blood for the 1%.
Very well said, Ajamu. And I couldn't agree more. And I think the American people actually agree with that as well, and do not support these massive, endless wars that are making us less secure, that are bankrupting us here at home, and that go hand in hand with this war on democracy. And as you described, Ajamu, this is a very real war on democracy, supported by Republicans and by Democrats, who are now clamping down on social media, on censoring social media, on reducing the our ability to network and use the internet as an organizing tool, who are restricting net neutrality in this assault on net neutrality. It really took an enormous grassroots movement to establish net neutrality, and that's being rolled back. People had to work very hard to get Obama to support that. Needless to say, Trump does not, and the head of the Federal Communications Commission right now, Ajit Pai, was originally an Obama appointee. So, this is the oligarchy that is clamping down on our First Amendment rights, our rights to a free and fair press, including the internet. We're also seeing the attack on our rights of protest with these J20 trials that are threatening. Now it's some 50 or 60 people who were arrested en masse at the Trump protests during his inauguration just for being there without any specific charges. Were mass arrested and are threatened with 50 or 60 years of incarceration. This is the same thing that was done to the people at Standing Rock. So this is an effort to intimidate us out of our rights of protest, which are so important as we go into these increasingly authoritarian days that we're facing. It's very important for us to be able to exercise our right of protest and to engage in mass civil disobedience. So, these are our basic rights: our right to protest, for free speech, our protections against invasions of our privacy, and Democrats just cooperated with Republicans to expand the surveillance state and warrantless spying. So we're seeing this bipartisan attack because democracy is one of the first victims in the military state, in empire. Democracy suffers here at home. And I just really thank you, Ajamu, for raising these points. And it's a war on third parties. And with the investigation of our campaign and my being called by the Senate Intelligence Committee to testify simply for having gone to Russia on a mission of peace, diplomacy, and climate action, urgent climate action, to share that agenda, not just with officials in Russia, but also at the Paris Climate Accords with Chinese officials as well, and officials from the UK. It's not a crime to talk to our allies or our adversaries. It's not a crime. That should be a responsibility of our elected officials as well as candidates to advance the cause of peace, justice, to open doors to diplomacy. In the words of John Kennedy, we must not negotiate out of fear, but we must never fear to negotiate. And, it's a real act of political intimidation that I and essentially the Green Party are being investigated now as if we were engaged in some sort of illicit activities, and there's no evidence of such a thing whatsoever. There is no just cause here to suspect any crime whatsoever. This is a purely political act of intimidation that accounts for our being called in right now. So it's another case of how this war mentality breeds an assault on our basic democratic rights here at home. It's very important that we continue standing up. So we got a big task ahead, and thank you, Ajamu, so much for all that you're doing and the fight that you're fighting. And thanks to all of you for listening tonight and for being a part of this real State of the Union. We ask you one more time to please share this conversation. Let's get the word out, and let's build the power to take back an America and a world that works for all of us. The power to create that world is in our hands. Let's build the Green Party as the political infrastructure for advancing that fight peacefully. Thank you all so much, and good night.